in this example, black pawns are going down and white can win. Now, it's not possible to start picking up pawns because, well, this is the only pawn that can be taken. But if we do take this pawn, and this is coming with a queen, and so, well, another option one can think of is this rook to take the pawn. But once again, if this happens, then a pawn is just promoting. King has to take the pawn, then the other pawn will become a queen. So these are just wrong ideas, clearly. So the reason why I'm mentioning them is that those are the first ideas that will come to mind to someone before they realize that they're just not working. So that takes time, you're wasting time. So it's important to remember a principle. The principle is that when these pawns are so close to the end, but the king is between them, then all you need to do is just place a rook to control the file. The rank under the king, the very last one. So the first move is check. The rook is coming down. We will be able to take this pawn and then the others. So now the king starts moving forward. Rook is going to a1, and now the king makes the only moves that make sense, because if the king were to go like somewhere else, they would just take this pawn and then this, and the rook is guarding all of this. So the king goes to c3, and here we have a just recurring pattern. So we take the pawn, and well, the king might try to attack our rook. Then we just play the rook to f1, and if king really wants to force us to sacrifice, then we can just pin the pawn and take a next move. Now going back to just a few seconds ago, we tried king b2, but if the king goes to c2, still trying to force the sacrifice of the rook, then once again it's just so important to have a rook protecting this rank. That's basically all that matters. So king e2 now is the move. This pawn cannot promote because it gets taken right away, and well, if this pawn is the one that promotes, then the rook can just take it. In this position, there's clearly these three pawns cannot be stopped. So white has to draw. You can't win. So the way to draw this is just to threaten the usual checkmate with either a repetition, so basically just to check forever, or, well, if black tries to escape, then check, and the king moves, and then rook a1 with a threat of checkmate, to which black has to respond by moving the king again. Moving to b8 wouldn't make sense since we can continue checking, so king goes to d8, and then we follow, still keeping the threat, and then we continue. So king f6, king g8, and now we can check. And actually we have to check also because this move here will come with a check. So the black player can promote, get a queen, giving a check, forcing the rook to sacrifice, and then winning later. So that means that now white has to check. King h7, and it continues like that. And now rook a8, still threatening mate, and this goes on forever, and white can get a draw simply by following the king. Here there's a similar pawn structure to the first clip. These three pawns, the king in between them. So now the best move here for white is rook d4. The reason is that we can start targeting this pawn, trying to take it immediately. So this move will probably be the worst for black, because then rook takes comes with check. And so if king to g5, then the rook takes this pawn, and well, the other two pawns are isolated, which means now the best move for black is pawn to f2. Pawn to d2 is not good because it's just get taken. Pawn to f2 in the attempt of getting the king away from the two pawns, and for the black king to infiltrate and go help his own pawns. So now king takes the pawn, and the king comes forward, trying to help the pawns. So here we use the rule of the square. Basically this is a 3 times 3 square, so we know that the king is inside it, so this king is guarding this pawn, so this pawn is not really promoting as long as the king is here. And what we need to do now is we cannot let the opponent king come closer, so we gotta leave this king here but keep pinning this pawn. So the next move is rook to a4. Now going back to the same position, after the move the key moves rook d4 in order to target the same pawn with multiple pieces. Black could have tried a different move. Black could have tried g4 because it could have tried to just go and accompany its pawn to the end. After rook takes and king goes to g3, now the key move is rook f4 because it puts pressure on this pawn, attacking it with 2 pieces. Now black has, well, 2 options, I will say. Well, actually more than 2, but if black pushes this pawn, then we can take with check. If king goes to g2, then once again we use the rook, check, and we make a fork. Rook could be extremely useful with that. If instead the king had gone up, the rook from f3 can simply either go to this square or even just check and then go and take the pawn.